Like most people, I think, I was not happy with the visual quality of Pokémon Sword and Shield. But unlike most people, at least from what I saw, I was more disappointed with their choice of art style than by the execution. The bad ground textures and ugly trees did bother me, yeah, but that's the kind of thing that I can look past if the whole still works. Rather, I feel like Pokémon Sword and Shield didn't have the visual charm that I associate with Pokémon. If you know me, you know that I love the aesthetic of Generation 2. The high contrast and limited colored palette made some of my favorite Pokémon sprites of all time, and the environments are not far behind. But I actually think it was the Advance and DS eras, in particular Heart Gold and Soul Silver, that really nailed the Pokémon aesthetic. The games each had their unique take on it, but as a whole, that era was bright and colorful and friendly and vibrant, perfectly fitting for a world filled with cartoon magical creatures and where the theme of the series is friendship. Those games had character, and their style embraced the franchise's cartoon magical creature identity. Starting in Generation 6 with the jump to 3D, the games have been losing some of that identity. Just a little bit at first, but by the time we get to Sword and Shield, we've moved far from what I consider the Pokémon aesthetic and landed in a kind of nowhere style that's overall very blah. So last year I made a video all about my gripes with the visual style of Sword and Shield, and if you haven't seen it, I think it's worth a watch. I also do a more in-depth look at the evolution of the Pokemon style. But ever since I made that, I've been stuck on a question. What would be the ideal Pokemon style in HD? It's not like no 3D Pokemon games have looked good. I think Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire are fantastic adaptation of the Hoenn look into 3D. And Let's Go captures so much of the Pokemon feel while still having a more unique approach. But neither of those is perfect. Let's Go abandons the strong outlines that every main series game until then had used, and they opt for a smooth shading style instead of the quasi-cell shading look that most games had used. And both Let's Go and Oraz suffer from being too small and cramped because they very nearly just recreate the 2D maps into 3D. So they don't really take advantage of being 3D. They don't have that kind of expansive feel that Sword and Shield actually did quite well. They also both have characters with more chibi proportions, meaning the big heads on little bodies, which most Pokemon games have had because it used to be kind of necessary on smaller screen resolutions. But official art and battle sprites have always shown more natural proportions, and so chibi characters feel classic, but not necessarily an essential element of the Pokemon style. So, after thinking about this for the past 8 months, I want to share with you how I think the Pokemon style should be rendered into 3D. Let me walk you through the choices I made for this piece. To start, I chose to recreate a static route from Galar. This is the lower portion of Route 5, in case you didn't recognize it. I wanted to show a unique perspective on a known area, to emphasize that this is a free camera. The free camera should be standard through the entire game. And ideally, it should be the kind of camera that you can point away from the character, rather than keeping them at the center of the frame at all times. This gives you more interesting camera angles, but more importantly, it lets you get something more akin to a first-person perspective, making the world feel more complete and immersive. I wanted to keep the blocky, grid-like nature of the overworld from classic Pokemon, hence all the sharp edges on the pond and the background cliffside. That's a purely aesthetic choice, but Pokemon existed on a grid for 6 full generations, plus Let's Go. To me, it's an important part of making it feel like Pokemon, although it is probably also the least important part. The foliage in the scene fully accepts that it exists in a cartoon fantasy world. Although there are 4 different kinds of trees in the background, plus the unique berry tree, every tree of the same kind is identical. And that's not because I wanted to save time so I copied and pasted them. Well, not only. I wanted to have variety in the kinds of trees, but I also wanted to capture the repetition from reusing tree sprites and the tree style from Generation 4. It's the same case with the tall grass. I really like the combination of overworld Pokemon and random exclamation mark Pokemon that we had in Sword and Shield. And this style of tall grass, where they almost look like little bushes, I think works really well for both modes of encounter. The grass is big and bulky enough that it wouldn't feel too jarring for even decent-sized Pokemon to spawn in it, or maybe even shake the bush and entice you to approach, like in Generations 4 and 5. Almost everything in this scene is textured, but it's pretty subtle overall. I actually used the textures from Let's Go for this because I thought they worked fantastically well. You might be able to recognize it in the low grass in particular. Unlike most of the field textures in Sword and Shield, these are relatively subtle. They are present enough to add some variety to the wide, flat spaces, but they don't draw your eye so much that you really notice them. And they don't try for anything close to realism. Probably the most important parts of this style are the shading and the outlines. Here's a good look at how I rendered my character. The lines are disproportionately thick because the camera is placed relatively far away. If you compare the line thickness from my character to the berry tree and to the breeder at the campground in the back, you can tell they do get thinner as they recede, but not too much, as a way to keep the important things from fading into the background. Anything that is truly in the background doesn't get any outlines. For the shading, I have another mockup that will give you a better look. This is a Pokédex mockup. It's actually a recreation of a Pokédex screenshot that I took, but it also gives you a good idea of how Pokémon would look in battle, too. The shadows are cel-shaded, meaning those sharp anime-like shadows, but the highlights are very soft and subtle. This is a direct nod to the sprite style of Generations 4 and 5, where the shadows had much higher contrast against the base color than the highlights did when it even had a highlight shade. Also of note is that the thickness of the outlines follows the shading to a degree, with thicker lines where the light doesn't reach. This wasn't something I could convey easily in the scene from Route 5, and neither was the sliver of fill light, the gentle lighting from behind the model that helps give the shadows more dimension. It wasn't super common, but some sprites did use this lighting technique. I'm really happy with how these mock-ups look. They're not perfect, of course, and I'd want to emphasize that they are mock-ups. I made the Umbreon mock-up mostly in Illustrator and Route 5 mostly in Photoshop. If I made this in 3D, I would expect the proportions of how big the trees and the characters are compared to each other to be more realistic. I would probably adjust the shapes of the trees a little bit, and the shading and the perspectives would be way more accurate. But I think these two pieces do give a very good idea of what an actual 3D Pokemon game could look like with this style. So, how excited would you be to play a Pokemon game that looks like this? If you like this style, I would appreciate it if you leave a comment and share this video with your friends. And if you don't, tell me why. Are there any elements of the Pokemon style that you think are important but that I didn't consider? If you're interested in how I made these mockups, keep watching and I'll tell you a little bit about that process. But if not, I won't hold it against you for moving on. Thank you for watching anyway. All right, you're sticking around? Cool, because this project was a journey. I've had it on my mind for like 8 months, right? But because I was busy with other videos, I didn't start working on it until about 2 months ago. This project is actually one of the reasons that I decided to reduce my video output, because I knew that I would need the time. I wanted to get this ready before we get any kind of glimpse into whatever release might be coming later this year, so I set this week as my deadline. But I started this project with a vision that was much grander, and too grand, honestly. The ideal way that I wanted to do this was to take existing assets from Sword and Shield and from Let's Go and maybe modify them a little bit, and then combine them to recreate multiple areas of Galar. I wanted at least one exterior, one interior, and one battle. And to accomplish that, I spent a fair amount of time in January learning how to use Blender, a 3D modeling program that I had never touched before. Not that my 1 semester of 3D modeling in high school would have really helped, even if I was still using the same program that we had back then. Anyway, I was thinking that I would find the assets I needed on the models resource, and then combine them the way I wanted, and apply my own shaders to get the right look. I got some help from my friend Ethan, who's been doing some work in Blender recently, but I faced a lot of hurdles beyond just the 3D learning curve. The models resource had a fairly limited selection of assets. Most of the overworld elements that I would need weren't on there, so I would also need to figure out a way to extract those assets myself, and a lot of what I did get off the models resource was really tough to work with. To be clear, I don't think that's on the site, it's just that the way that the Pokemon models are made and rigged seemed really counterintuitive to what I was learning. So even though I did make some good progress on the shaders, I couldn't get it to look right when I applied it to a Pokemon. So I gave up on using 3D and started to look for ways that I could make this happen in 2D instead. But the problem was getting the perspective right, especially with that blocky grid layout that I wanted. Perspective was very important. I really struggled to wrap my head around that until I discovered Pokémon Unity, which is a Pokemon game that uses DS-era graphics that is made in the game dev software Unity 3D, and that actually includes tools to make your own maps. Even though most of the DS-era assets are 2D sprites, the environments are 3D, and because Unity is a 3D program, that meant that I could, at least in theory, position the camera however I wanted. It was exactly what I needed. Except that it meant learning an entirely different 3D program that I had also never used before. But after facing some compatibility problems and watching a lot of tutorials and doing a ton of useless Googling, and losing all of my work to a crash when I was about halfway through, I did manage to get this mockup built. Thank you. Finally, I was at a stage where I knew exactly how to finish the project. I just pulled this into Photoshop, added some pieces of screenshots from Sword and Shield into the scene, and then built from there. By the way, thank you Thought Bubble on Twitter who extracted the Let's Go textures that I needed when I couldn't find them online. I honestly don't think that I could have finished this on time if I'd had to make or extract the textures myself. At least the Umbreon mockup was much easier. I didn't even need to learn how to use a single program. I actually did that one first. I just traced over the original screenshot in Illustrator and then worked off of that. I'm really happy with the result, but I'm still interested in actually seeing this done in 3D. At this point, I've accepted that I can't do it all in 3D myself, but depending on the cost, I'm considering hiring people to do it for me. So if you have any of the expertise involved here, extracting and using assets from Let's Go and Sword and Shield, 3D modeling and assembling 3D scenes, and making and working with cartoon shaders, let me know. Maybe we can work together. Well, thank you again for watching, especially since you stuck around this far. I would really like to take a little break after this long and stressful project, but gotta prepare for Pokemon Day next week. So thank you to my friends and patrons who gave me feedback in this process and kept me motivated, especially luxury patron Ethan from Chicago. I'll see you in the next chapter.